Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, where today's brightest minds in the medical device industry go to get their most useful and actionable insider knowledge direct from some of the world's leading medical device experts and companies.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking with Michelle Lott. Michelle Lott is the founder and principal of leanRAQA, leanRAQA. She and her team have supported over 100 companies with regulatory strategy, regulatory submissions, quality systems, compliance, due diligence, technical support services, and what she calls grief counseling, because dealing with regulators can be emotionally draining. Her clients delegate those things to her so they can focus on winning in the marketplace. Michelle has served a 4-year term on the FDA Good Manufacturing Practices Advisory Committee, otherwise known as the DGMP. As we all know, we love our acronyms. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from Troy State University and is a certified executive leader in regulatory affairs from RAPS and the Kellogg University. Today, we talked a little bit about the differences in the US versus the EU and the regulatory pathways and some of the pros and cons and some of the hurdles that you'll have to go through with each one of these different markets. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. We'll see you next.
Hey, everyone. Welcome back to the Global Medical Device Podcast. This is Etienne, your co-host. With us today is John Speer, the host of the podcast, as well as the founder of Greenlight Guru. And also with us today is Michelle Lott. We're going to be talking about some of the challenges of the US versus EU and your go-to-market strategy, how that impacts investments and so forth. But before we get into that, Michelle also has a podcast. Would you want to talk about it just briefly before so we don't forget?
Yep. So my own podcast is RAQA Today, and you can find me, Apple, Spotify, all the places where you get your podcasts.
All right. I see you on LinkedIn sometimes. You make maybe complex, maybe not complex. I don't know. Just depends on your perspective. Different regulatory topics, really kind of fun. And I assume you probably do the same with the podcast. So,
yep. I tell when I get new customers and they're like, well, why should we work with you? And I said, well, it's easy to find a competent regulatory person, but how many are you going to A, enjoy working with, and B, are going to be able to make you laugh when you probably really feel like crying?
Michelle, we've known each other for a few years, but my favorite thing that you did was leading up into the EU MDR go live, and you had the T minus, X number of days and all these sorts of things. And I think it was super helpful because I think a lot of people sat on the sidelines thinking, oh, I got plenty of time, blah, 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 or they're going to delay it, or they're going to push it. And of course they did because of COVID. But, without that reminder, I have to wonder how many folks would have been struggling, with their EU MDR adoption.
Well, and, I had the T minus going, but now I have the T plus going because I feel like people are still in denial, in two separate ways. Like the first is the people who have certificates that expire in May of 24. And they think that they still have enough time to get their certificates reissued. And it's like, okay, if your technical documentation isn't turned in full in December, you're not going to, have a continuity of your CE mark in any form. And then there's still people, I thought this was funny. I lost business that I was quoting on because the potential client went with a consultant that could guarantee that they would have a CE mark by May of next year. And they hadn't even talked to a notified body yet. They hadn't even made a phone call. And I'm like, I can't even guarantee you that I can get somebody to look at your documentation before May of next year.
Right. How did that turn out? Did you happen to hear the result? I'm just curious.
No, that was just last month. So I'm okay,
goodness.
Great. You found somebody that lied to you, basically.
Well, good luck, right? So, yeah.
At least they'll get their money back with that guarantee. Oh my goodness, maybe.
Right.
Well, so I'm curious. So we got the T plus now. Are there any T minus dates that we should be thinking about? Or obviously this is the big one, the T plus.
Yeah, it's just that if you don't have a relationship with a notified body yet, you're already almost too late. And you just can't make any commitments to or marketing plans for the EU right now in terms of timing.
I've talked to a few companies that they've looked at the EU MDR requirements and they've actually made the strategic decision just to let their CE mark go and they're just going to pull out of EU. Have you seen things like that? And any comments or thoughts?
Yeah, so I have seen, a lot of small companies, they just are choosing not to go to market in the EU. But then I've even heard that companies, as large as Nestle are withdrawing up to 20% of their product lines that are, almost like commodity products because the value and the return on revenue is just not there to maintain MDR.
What's the main thing that holds people back? I mean, obviously it's a big documentational challenge, but what would you say? I don't know if you could pick one or probably half a dozen.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I think it's the cost and also the clinical data challenge. It used to be that the FDA had the reputation of requiring a lot of clinical data, being more difficult to get to market than a notified body. And under MDR, that paradigm has shifted to where, companies are bringing their product to market in the US first because of the burden of the clinical data in the EU. I mean, I have a client that makes wound drain catheters. It's just a silicone tube with a hole in the end. That's it. They were up classified to class 3 under MDR, and they have to have full out clinical trials for a product that's been on the market 40 or 50 years.
Holy cow. I mean, that's crazy to think about. I mean, to go to class 3. I mean, I agree with you. I think the clinical aspects are really causing a lot of challenges for folks. How are you seeing companies address that, though? I mean, because I think for a lot of folks, this is like, of all the requirements of the MDR, this is probably the newest part of MDR that maybe, they had bits and pieces of, but generally they didn't have the whole post-market clinical follow-up and all those things once you get to market. I mean, some of those products obviously required clinical data to get to market, but what are companies doing? How are they addressing this in an effective way?
I think that the companies who have got, kind of newer or novel technology where they were going to have to do a clinical trial for one purpose or the other are in better shape than those with that longstanding, technology that's been on the market for decades. I think that a lot of those commodity products still haven't figured out how they're going to cross that bridge because you can't, US, you can use real world evidence. That's not a thing in Europe. And they don't really consider like your complaints or lack thereof to be, it's just a small portion of what they consider clinical data.
So you alluded to the timeline or being able to or not being able to get your CE marking with the guarantee. What do the timelines look like right now?
So the actual review is taking the better part of a year or more, so 12 to 18 months. And then once you get through your review, it's still taking another 6 months or more to get your certificate issued by the notified bodies and the competent authorities.
Okay. Wow.
I know leading up to the EU MDR, one of the big challenges then, and I suspect this is still the case, but very limited number of notified bodies.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can remember, just being a few months out and it was like, there's still only right around 10 notified bodies. How many notified bodies?
I think that they're up to 28 now, and that's down from, almost 130, that were originally designated underneath the MDD. So
there's still a bottleneck there, right?
100%. Yeah. And the competent authorities aren't getting notified bodies designated. You would think that as we were getting closer to the certificates expiring, that they would be, kind of pushing the notified bodies through to accommodate the certificates and make sure that, Europe doesn't lose access to important products. But that's just not the case.
So what do companies need to be doing right now? I mean, I guess if somebody doesn't have that put together, there's a drop dead date.
Yeah. So if you want to go or to stay on the market, I think that's the first decision, is to do a market analysis to find out if your revenue model is going to support the year over year cost, because you've got notified body fees that are recurring. You've got authorized representatives, and now you have to have a UK authorized representative, an EU authorized representative, a Swiss representative. You might have to have Northern Ireland if you don't have the right combination of marks and representation. And so just the third party fees alone are exorbitant. So the first thing is to do that market analysis. And then if they decide that Europe is still something that they want to do, the second, you need to get in line with a notified body. Most, if you're not already an existing client, they're just not taking new applications. They'll say, call us back in a year and see where we're at.
So I'm curious, let's say I'm a company that has products on the market and, I'm a little late to the game, but, I'm like following Michelle's advice. I'm going to reach out to my notified body or what have you. And they're like, well, here's our timeline. And it's, when I add it up, it's going to be, beyond that May 2024. Is there any recourse, or is there any if I'm in the queue with my notified body, can I present some sort of, information or documentation to the competent authorities that says, hey, we're working on it. Can we keep our products on the market? Or is it just going to be, either you got it or you're out of the market?
I think that that's the big unknown, and that's where everybody, I think, is still speculating a lot. The competent authorities haven't published any type of thinking or transition plan beyond that the certificates are just not going to continue to be, or not going to be viable. And they haven't published any ideas on what are they going to do with the product in that limbo period either. Like, are we just going to all of a sudden in 2024 have Europe without, important life-sustaining devices? I mean, as simple as a wound drain catheter is, try having an open heart surgery without one.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's to me, the bigger, I'll say gotcha, I guess, for right now. It doesn't seem like anyone from more the competent authority side of things is looking at the impact on the quality and the healthcare system in Europe because of this. And it's there's got to be, surely someone somewhere has done some sort of analysis that says, hey, this is the potential issues that we could see in Europe. I mean, I hope anyway, because, then you can see, can you imagine the United States becoming a destination for medical tourism? I mean,
that's
it
crazy.
could happen, right?
Yeah. The problem is, I don't know if anybody in the actual government did the analysis. I'm sure there's healthcare agencies and, an industry has done their own analysis. But the government in Europe got such a black eye after the PIP scandal. Mm-hmm. And, they were already in discussions about the medical device regulation. But when PIP happened, they got a black eye for not protecting their own patient populations. And so now they've just gone to the opposite extreme in an effort to try to prove their patient population aren't guinea pigs, basically, for the rest of the world.
But so one of the things when I see these companies pulling out of the EU, just saying, hey, we're just going to let it expire, it's not impossible. I have some conversations with other people who say, well, once you do EMDR, you'll never go back. So I'm curious where your opinion is. You're a little closer to the true regulation. What is your opinion of the actual regulations?
I think if you're going to bite the bullet and do MDR, I think probably other geographies are going to be a breeze in comparison. Short of maybe, I think Japan is still pretty rigorous, but, definitely to get MDR or CE mark, I think will definitely set you up well to enter the US and Australia and some of the other markets. It's just the sustainability of it. And, and that's another big difference with how products come to market in the US is that, it's a linear flow. You put your submission in, 510K, de novo, PMA, it goes through their review process and it comes out and your device is cleared. And unless you make changes that require you to do a new submission, you don't go back through that process. But in the EU, you're going through that process, with your quality management system, and to an extent, product changes annually, and then a full recertification every 3 years.
Wow.
There's also no such thing as grandfathering underneath the EU, so if a technical standard, say, 60601 for electrical safety changes from the time you first got your product authorized, you have to redo all that testing. So it's a living system.
So you do have to follow the updates to other international standards.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Interesting.
Yep.
Well, Etienne, I think you started off by saying something along the lines, sort of comparing and contrasting EU versus US. Is my memory correct? I know it's only been a few minutes ago.
So the challenges of the two. Yeah.
All right. So we talked a lot about the EU side of things. I guess, what are some thoughts? How would you compare and contrast that with FDA?
So there's a couple of things that you have to keep in mind. Is, we just talked about the kind of a more linear submission process. But then the other part of that is the quality management system, which is where you guys really play and help out. And you have to have an ISO 13485 certification for your quality management system, which is yet another fee and certificate and hoops to jump through, things to maintain. And those are, annual. And if you have critical suppliers, that certification body will be going in and auditing your critical suppliers quality management system as well. And all of this has to kind of all come together at the same time. Well, in the US, they don't even really require a quality management system until you put your product into commercialization. And so I see all kinds of startup companies that don't have design controls, that didn't follow a process, and they were having to reverse engineer their entire documentation once they put a quality management system after their submissions in place. So it's just very much more of a living, you're going to maintain a lot of certifications, you're going to maintain a lot of testing, and you're going to have to keep your product. You might have to redesign your product as you go as well in Europe to make sure it can pass these changing performance standards and expectations.
So it sounds like even though it's a little easier to go through the FDA, you could potentially have a better product coming out if you started going the EUMDR process, potentially based on the design controls and the reworking of some of the documentation after you go to market. Is that kind of accurate what I'm hearing? Or
your product is going to be living and it's going to be considered whatever the EU has termed to be state of the art, because that's how they define state of the art, is with technical performance standards. I think it's very interesting when ISO 14971 was updated in 2019, they added a definition for state of the art for the first time. And guess what state of the art is not? State of the art. It's like, by this, we do not mean the most technologically advanced or progressive. We mean generally recognized as safe.
Yeah. I mean, some of these terms are definitely interesting when you apply them in the medical device industry, because, a standard, by the time a version of a standard is published, it's definitely not current, most up-to-date way of doing things per se. I mean, that standard probably took a couple of years at least for that to be revised. So yeah, sometimes there's things that are, state of the art from a standard perspective, which, is the opposite of that definition for sure. There are some things about the EUMDR. I mean, the fact that there's we'll say an attempt to implement these policies so that you treat your products as a living thing, right? I like that part of it. I like the total product lifecycle approach. I mean, I'm a big fan of making sure your design controls and your design history file and your risk management file always are a current representation of your product. But, it's that flip side that the way in order to do that or to demonstrate that is a little bit onerous, So it's like, how can we find that balance in between?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the ongoing cost of, staying up with those performance standards as well, so that's yet another layer of cost and expense. I think you've mentioned my LinkedIn, and you guys have probably also seen the different stages of regulatory grief that I talk about. I think a lot of companies are still in the denial stage. And I think that until we get into MDR, where MDD and MDD certificates don't exist anymore, and have that is the reality, I think that there's going to be a lot of companies that continue to just denial and hope is not a regulatory strategy, but they seem to be running their businesses like it.
My own personal question. So I'm curious how you walk people through those different stages of regulatory grief.
It's a lot of hand holding, and there's just a lot of, I use what I call a submission risk matrix for those areas that, I can't get the client to, stomach or buy, or they just want to, take the risk and let's see what happens, so I'll keep this running list of these things that we can't, get agreement on, and ideas for them for a potential mitigation, and, what can happen with their submission. And we all have to at least, agree to disagree on those points. But just for instance, biocompatibility under the MDR and under changing expectations with FDA, there's no such thing as a well-known material anymore. You are going to have to do significant testing on your own device, and you can't just say this is made out of silicone and silicone's been used in medical devices for 50 years. but still have clients who insist on, hey, let's write a rationale about these are well-known materials.
Michelle, you've been helping companies with this transition now, well, ever since I assume it was announced that this was going to happen. I hope you got some success stories or at least some examples of instances where the company, like, they did it, and this is how they did it. This is how they went into it. I guess share some of those insights with folks so that they can see it's, it's easy to push it off and say, oh, maybe something will change. I'm hoping, right? But like you said, hope's not a strategy. For those that are, being proactive about this, what are some things that you've seen go really well?
Well, and first, let me just even put some context around how many MDR certificates are even out there. Only 1% of the certificates that were issued under MDD through those same people have got MDR certificate. So we're not talking about, there's not this huge amount of people with success stories because so few have gone through it at all. And I think that there were 18,000 certificates issued under MDD, and only 1% of those have made it all the way through MDR. I think it's not going to be fast. If you do it, you have to really own it. You can't rely on rationales. I think the people that, almost treated their product like this is brand new and almost started scratch with their testing, I think have succeeded much easier than people who were trying to, just ride that wave of, well, we've had a CE mark forever. It's not going to really be that different, that did much more than just update their GSPR checklist and call it done. So, yeah, I think it's going to be the testing, the not making rationalizations, not making justifications, and having everything done when you turn it in and not waiting for the notified body to tell you that something's inadequate or turn something in advance of your testing being completed or updated.
And as opposed to...
Sorry, this is a good one.
Yeah.
It takes a village now to write a submission. It used to be your regulatory people, would go in a hole and, they would come out, with maybe an engineer and the clinical person. But now to properly prepare technical documentation, it is truly a cross-functional effort. And it's going to require a lot of very in-depth expertise in things like biocompatibility, sterility, packaging. So, it's very much it's going to take a village now. It's not just you're not going to be able to silo your regulatory people.
So at least one of the things that I'm kind of taking away from this is there's definitely a more robust testing requirement. So regardless of whether you're 304 stainless steel or silicone, you're going to have to start really be thinking and focusing about biocompatibility, cytotoxin, things like that, or at least an assessment of those. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. What other things would you say are stark contrasts that if you haven't, maybe you could get by without it in the FDA, you're not going to get by without this in the EU MDR? Anything else come to mind? And it probably depends on the device, I'm sure. Sorry.
What did you say? I'm sorry.
Well, it may depend on the device too, I suppose. But yeah.
Those are the biggest things that we've already covered.
Okay.
I think that, a big difference in how that you have to approach not just the regulatory agencies, but your strategy is in your fundraising. I see, two mistakes that people are still, I'm in a lot of angel groups and I'll still see pitches that, we're going to go to Europe first. And I'm like, 2017 called and wants this regulatory strategy back. Or I see people that are pitching and that they're saying the right things. They're aware, of that they're going to bring it to market in the US first. But then I'll hear their investors say, 20 years ago, I had a huge exit because I had this great, European business. And why aren't you going to Europe? And I'll call investors out. I'm like, you are just, giving this person bad advice that's going to cost you to lose your money. Because again, 20 years ago called and wants its strategy back. It's just not a thing.
Yeah, there was a period of time a few months ago that I had a conversation with a few folks, both from US and EU. And basically what they said then, and I suspect that that's probably still very, very true now, is startups especially, they're not going to Europe first. It's not the more favorable market. I mean, used to, like you said, 10, 15 years ago, Europe was a more predictable path because I could understand it a little bit more clearly. But it just seems strange that today FDA is the more predictable path, and who'd have thought that, So I do agree. I think all these startups, if they're thinking about, and I guess folks, if you're listening and you're thinking about going to market in Europe first, you might want to reach out to someone like Michelle because she can help educate and inform you of the perils of that thinking. So beware.
Yeah. And one of the other things I'll just throw out, since we're maybe talking advertising, for example, for Michelle specifically, we're actually going to have a panel at the True Quality Conference in San Diego, where we actually talk about the go-to-market strategy, EU versus the US. Michelle's one of the highlights of that panel. I couldn't tell you who else is on that panel right now, but definitely check that out. We'll have the link in the show notes. You can look a little bit more into that.
I have this conspiracy theory about that it's like a macroeconomic model, because if you think about the people that are large enough that sit down at the tables with the regulators and are part of, the companies that are sitting there helping to drive these changes. It's not the small to mid-sized companies that are defining the future of regulations. It's these behemoths that already control large parts of the market. Well, they don't do their own innovation anymore. They're not doing their own, for the most part, design and development. They acquire startups and their technology, and that's how they build their product portfolios now. Well, before, a company would have this global commercialization strategy to get its valuation up. And now, if the regulations prevent you from being able to go into a global commercialization strategy, and the valuation of your company is based off of a US market share alone, what does that do for your multiple and your exit strategy? And all these companies can get these startup companies for virtually a song compared to what they might have if they had a true global presence.
Yeah, sadly, that's so true. I think it's now more than ever challenging to be a startup in the medical device space. I mean, I've been in this space since 98. So I guess that's 24 or so years. I can remember back in the day, maybe let's go to probably 15 or maybe 20 years ago, that there was decent amount of funding available for startups at that point in time. But it's not non-existent, but a lot of that's gone away, or it's being invested much later in the company's maturation process. I mean, the cash to cover seed funding and things like that, seed capital, and that sort of thing is harder and harder to come by. So that friends and family and, the early angel or two round has to carry a company much, much further. And now it's compounded by, this new twist from a regulatory perspective where essentially, most companies, not all, but they look at the US and Europe almost as a 50-50 market share, of their total opportunity. And now you cut part of that off. I mean, that's another handicap against the startup. So I'm sure startups will survive and they'll figure it out. But you're right. I mean, there's a lot of cards that are against them right now.
So my question about that, though, is to go back to your conspiracy theory, Michelle. If these behemoths are the ones influencing the regulations, which I totally agree, and they are making it more difficult for the startups, but then if they acquire these startups, let's say at a discounted rate, they still have a lot of legwork to do to get that product to those other markets. Or is there a piece I'm missing here?
That's the point, right? Yeah. That's the point. To play along with the conspiracy theory is, if I'm the 800-pound gorilla making the rules and I make it so difficult for you to follow those rules, but I like your technology, I'm going to get a deal on that because you can't survive long enough to make it into those markets. Whereas I have the capital and the resources to make it so, and I help write the rules because I'm the behemoth.
I'm already doing it. We already have the quality management system that's compliant with MDR. We already have our ISO certificate. Don't worry your pretty little head about those things. But I'm not going to pay you for them either.
Well, I guess the startups need to band together somehow. I'm not sure how it's going to work, but follow Michelle on LinkedIn.
It's actually a good idea. What if all these startups could like form some sort of alliance or something,
Yeah, it's a pipe dream of mine that one day, like, I want to start like an advocacy group for startups and small companies and be that voice and have them organize. And, I've kind of started doing it to a point in the US with, just trying to get people organized around comments on key guidance documents and putting them on the Federal Register. And so, I think it's just really important that they have you have your say. It's the same thing. If you don't vote, you shouldn't get to complain about public policy, right? Well, if you don't tell the FDA when they're asking for comments, if you don't participate in that, should you get to complain about what comes out of it?
I think here's another thing that when I share this statistic with folks, oftentimes they're very surprised. Like 80% of medical device companies globally have 50 or fewer employees. That blows people away. I mean, that's the overwhelming majority of companies would be considered small companies. And to your point, the companies that are making the rules, I mean, there's like 10 of them, right? And they're so friggin' large that
2% of all medical device companies are those big boys.
Yeah.
FDA calls a company large if they have over 50 employees. That to FDA is a big medical device company.
Right.
It's not a big company, but it's a big medical device company.
Right. So, I want folks listening because there's at least an 80% chance that if you're listening, you probably work at a small medical device company, 50 or fewer employees. We need to all band together and have a voice. I mean, follow Michelle, to her point, there's guidances that are published often, draft guidances, or Federal Register where FDA is soliciting comments and feedback. You have that opportunity to chime in. You don't have to work for one of the 2% very large companies to do so. But if you don't say anything, the big boys, they have teams of people that's all they do is focus on that. And if you don't chime in, others will be making the rules for you to follow.
And just so everybody knows how this comment period works is the FDA has to respond to every comment left in the Federal Register. It's not that they can just read them and say, oh, that's nice to know, or that's something to think about. They have to actually articulate comment by comment a response to it.
I didn't realize that. Interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, I can just think of a few draft guidances that are still out there. I think the QMSR and the cybersecurity, which I know there's a lot of discussion around right now. So yeah, that's a lot of opportunity.
The QMSR comment period is open until I think the third week of May 24 or so.
Very cool. Any other thoughts or comments you'd like to just give the listeners or recommendations before you see them in live, of course, but
yeah. So on my website, I have got a market analysis tool and a regulatory pathway assessment. And if you are thinking of going to Europe or staying there and you have not done that, download those, give me a call, put some time on my calendar, and let's talk about it from, first a business perspective, but then a regulatory perspective to see if this is something that makes sense for you.
Awesome. We'll include those as a link in the show notes as well. Very cool.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, John, anything to add?
No, all good.
Yeah.
I look forward to seeing everybody in person.
Me too.
That's a thing. It's still a thing.
2022, we can get back together. I'm really excited.
Yeah.
Thank you all for listening. You've been listening to the Global Medical Device Podcast with Michelle Lott. Check the links in the show notes. We mentioned a few different things throughout the episode. This is powered by Greenlight Guru. If you are in the medical device space looking for a quality management system or are just trying to get to market, greenlight.guru is the only medical device success platform that was designed by medical device professionals for medical device professionals. So head over to www.greenlight.guru to check out more. We will see you all next time.